For every great American novel that has ever been published, there is hundreds, if not thousands, of writers who are hoping that theirs will be the next one. We know that it's difficult to be successful in pretty much every field that the world has to offer us. It requires hard work, it requires dedication, and it requires a refusal to give up. But I would argue that it also requires another element, one that we don't talk about nearly as often. Let me give you an example of that element, if I could, please. Years ago, there was a guy who dreamed of becoming a great American writer. His whole ambition in his life was to become a full-time writer. He wanted to publish novel after novel in the hopes that it would help build his legacy and that he would have a name that would be shared among the greats. But after years of pursuing that dream, it wasn't happening. It seemed like everything he tried to write was not getting published. People wouldn't even look twice at it. And he was just struggling along in his life. In order to make ends meet for his family, he was working full-time as an English lit teacher, but his family was living in a double-wide trailer. He and his wife had a toddler and another one on the way. The only space that he had available for him to write was a tiny little desk that was wedged in their laundry room in between the washer and the dryer. And every day, as soon as classes were done, he would go lock himself into that laundry room and type away, hoping beyond all hope that something would catch, that something would make sense, that something would get taken. He submitted story after story for publication, trying to get somebody to read his words, but nothing seemed to land. Occasionally, every so often, one of his short stories would be published by a small magazine of some kind, but it was never a whole lot of money. In fact, it was just enough to help keep that family off of welfare. The writer himself felt defeated. He constantly felt that his dream was done, and he was ready to just give up on it entirely and get rid of the typewriter that they kept in the laundry room. But the school that he worked for gave him an enticing offer. They asked him if he'd like to become the faculty advisor to the debate team. It wasn't exactly something that thrilled him, but it did offer a slight pay increase and would help ease some of the tension on the family's finances. And so he was kind of excited about this prospect. And when he returned home and shared with this opportunity with his wife and told her all about it, she wasn't quite as enthusiastic as he was. In fact, after he had finished laying out what all this would mean for their family, she asked him only one question. Will you still have time to write? It seemed like a strange response because, again, they were struggling paycheck to paycheck, even trying to stretch the last dime as far as they possibly could. But he decided to go ahead and answer honestly. Not much. His wife looked at him dead in the eyes and said, well, then you can't take it. She believed in her husband's writing. She believed in her husband's dream. More importantly, she believed in her husband. And she was willing to continue on a little bit longer if that meant that he could someday pursue his dream further than what it was. But the family did have a rule when it came to his writing. Well, the couple had a rule when it came to the writing. I don't think the toddler cared. But that rule was whatever it was that he wrote, no matter how good or bad he thought it was, she had to read it. The hope was that as she would read over this sort of thing, she wanted to look over his shoulder and maybe she would see something that he couldn't. Or maybe she would be able to say to him, you know what, this is okay, but maybe it'd be better if you did this. To kind of give him points and critiques and criticism in the hopes of making him better. She had read hundreds of starts to his stories, a lot of which were good, a lot more were not quite as good. But she was reading everything that he wrote, and the rule remained in their family. And so you can imagine her surprise when one day as she went to go clean out that laundry room, as she went to go and do the laundry and also clean up after him because he was not exactly a neat person, she found something in the trash can. A small stack of papers that she had not seen before, with writing on it, a story that she had not yet read. And so she fished it out of the trash can and she straightened it all out and she read over that. When he came home that day from work, she was holding that stack of crumpled up paper saying, "You have something here. You need to keep going on this." He told her he didn't think anybody would want to read that kind of story, that anybody even cared about that, but she encouraged him to keep going anyway. 9 months later, he finally finished a complete novel. The whole thing, beginning with that scrap of trashed paper. And they submitted it to a publisher in the hopes of maybe seeing something take place, because as he continued writing it, he kept getting more and more excited about the story. And so when they finally sent it off, he had that renewed confidence, that renewed vigor in his gift, and they sent it off to that first publisher, and it was rejected. That's okay. Nobody ever gets it on their first try, right? So he submitted it to another. They rejected it too. 30 different publishers, all rejecting it. And as more and more rejections came in, the writer began to think again that nothing was ever going to come from this book. Nobody ever cared. Nobody wanted to read it. Some of the notes that the publishers had sent back had been less than encouraging about what the book had entailed in it. Still, his wife kept encouraging him. Send it out again. Try one more time. And so finally, he sent it to the 31st publisher. One day as he was in the school and he was in the teacher's lounge grading papers, the school secretary came over the PA system asking him to make his way towards the office because he had a phone call. He thought that was a little strange because he didn't own a phone at home. And yet his wife was on the line, holding in her hands a telegram from the 31st publisher, telling them that they were going to publish his book and that they were sending him a $2,500 cash advance on the sales. Something that felt like winning the lottery to this small family. It wouldn't end there, though, because within a year, the book itself had sold over 1 million copies. It went into paperback publishing, and the cash advance that they received that time was $250,000, making the initial $2,500 feel like pennies. Still wasn't done just yet, because shortly thereafter, the director contacted him asking if he could turn his book into a movie. And suddenly the payout was millions of dollars. He was finally able to quit his job as a teacher, to move his family out of the double-wide trailer they were living in, and to realize the dream that he had always had of being a full-time writer. Had it not been for his wife's encouragement and her refusal to let him quit, the world might never have read a single novel by Stephen King. Sometimes we need that cheerleader in our lives. We need that person or even a group of people who will continue to encourage us and uplift us and keep us going when we feel like giving up. Oftentimes that's what makes the difference between us continuing to pursue a goal or a path or us just throwing in the towel and not achieving the thing that we set out to do. Knowing that there are people who love us, who support us, and who are willing to encourage us to keep us going is able to keep us on that path to success in whatever it is that we want to pursue. I mean, regardless as to how you feel about the novels of Stephen King, and I know different people have different opinions of them, his wife was on to something. I mean, clearly he was successful, right? I mean, we're talking now, that was almost 5 decades ago. The man has published over 65 books. She knew something was on there, and had it not have been for that encouragement, that might never have happened. Sometimes we just need that voice of encouragement from a coach or a teacher or a friend or a parent or a spouse or whoever it is in your life. It's just willing to come alongside of you and help pick you up, to spur you to keep going, to lift you up when you've fallen short, or to stand up for us when we really need it. Encouragement cannot be understated when it comes to our faith. Our need for encouragement as Christians is just there. let's be real here, and let's be completely honest as to why we need encouragement. Sometimes our faith is hard. Just me? Sometimes our faith is difficult. It's difficult for us to want to keep going. It's difficult to go through periods of times where it feels like God is just not listening to us. It's difficult to go through times where it feels like everything is falling apart around us, no matter how much we pray, no matter how much we strive for. God is just not there. Sometimes we need the encouragement and the reminder of those that care about us to know that just because we struggle right now, it doesn't mean that it's always going to be that way. Just because we walk through those times where we're wondering, is God listening? Is God there? But it doesn't mean that we're bad Christians. Just because we have times where our struggle gets a little too difficult for us, it doesn't mean that God is done with us. Oftentimes that's the difference between someone who continues to live a life of faith and somebody who leaves the faith entirely. We need the encouragement of people who care about us, who love us, and want to see us continue to grow in our faith. It is a simple truth that has existed since the very beginning of the church itself. Over the last several weeks, we have been examining the earliest church, and we've been looking at the ways that they interacted with each other and how they were able to develop and function as a community. A group of people who cared for one another, who loved each other, who taught each other, and who, yes, encouraged each other. Again, I don't think we can forget in our examination of this early church, like we have to keep this in mind. They're literally figuring this out as they go. There is no playbook. There's no set routine. And I think oftentimes, we get a little too focused on the routine. We get a little too focused on making sure that our holy checklist is made every week. We get a little too wound up over the things that contribute our time together. And if something doesn't happen, we feel like, well, then it wasn't really church. But for that early church, man, they were just figuring it out as they went. They had no idea what they were doing. They just chose to love each other. Simple as that. So as we continue to look at this series and as we get ready to close it out today, I think it's important that we once again look at our theme passage, if you will, our root text in Acts chapter 2, verses 42 through 47, to see the ways that this group encouraged one another. It says, "And they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. And awe came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles. And all who believed were together and had all things in common. They were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved." This church in community, as we've examined this text and as we've looked over it for the last 4 weeks now, it should be painfully obvious to you that this is a group of people who genuinely love each other. That everything that they did was rooted in that care and that love that they had for one another. And as we look at this, it's painstakingly obvious that they supported each other both spiritually and physically. That they taught each other what it meant to be a follower of Christ. And simply by being together, by surrounding themselves with one another consistently, they brought encouragement to each other. Right? There is something encouraging about simply being in the same space as like-minded people, is there not? I've been to a lot of different sporting events in my life. My favorite, by far, is going to watch live professional wrestling. There is nothing like a group of people joining together to chant the same things over and over again, or to recite the catchphrase along with the wrestler, or to simply just make fun of one guy in particular. It's exciting, it's exhilarating, it's encouraging, because for us pro wrestling fans out there, we feel oftentimes very isolated. So to be in an arena filled with thousands of other wrestling fans, it's nice to know you're not the only one. But there is something encouraging when we are all together as a body of believers. There is something that encouraged that early church. And again, we're talking about a group of people who were all brand new to this thing. Right? This whole thing takes place after that infamous sermon by Peter, the one that I timed out, and it came to about 3 minutes. And 3,000 people came to know Jesus. And so they don't know what it means to be a Christian. And they are living in a culture and a time period where it's an incredibly hostile environment for them to profess the name of Jesus. I mean, they just killed the guy like 2 months ago. And so to be around people who believe the same as them, that Jesus was in fact the Messiah, that he was the Emmanuel, that he is still reigning in heaven, how could that not be encouraging to them? But even beyond that, there was encouraging happening on a more individual basis. Over the past couple of weeks, we've been examining this early church, and we've sort of inadvertently been focusing on a single individual. I'm going to be real with you. As much as I would love to say that I'm so smart that that's how I mapped the whole thing out, that'd be a lie. Like, this just sort of happened by accident, but what a beautiful accident that it has been. We've been talking about this individual that we don't really focus that much on when it comes to church. We know all the big names. We know Peter and Paul and David and all the other big biblical characters that we talk about over and over again. Man, we watched as Barnabas willingly gave up generational wealth by selling off a field of his in order to make sure that his fellow Christians were provided for. That if anybody had a need, Barnabas is covering it. He doesn't need to know who. We watched as Barnabas, the same guy, stood up for Paul when he tried to join the church, and they were, again, I think smartly, reluctant to let him do so. He was willing to stand up and say, no, this guy's for real. He cared so much about Paul that he was willing to join up with him, that he became the mentor of Paul himself. And so fittingly so, it makes sense that we again talk about Barnabas today as we discuss encouragement within the church. After all, the name Barnabas means son of encouragement. Though admittedly, the text that we're about to discuss, on the surface, might not seem like an encouraging moment in Barnabas' life. See, when we flip over a few pages to Acts chapter 15, things are a little bit different. We see a fairly significant moment in the lives of both Barnabas and in Paul. A moment that would really kind of define things for them going forward. To give you a better context and an understanding, Paul and Barnabas at this point have been joined at the hip for years. Everybody in the church knows who Paul and Barnabas are. I get a feeling that sometimes they're the ones who are a little louder when they get all together. They're the ones who are a little bit of a troublemaker, and maybe every now and again Peter is shaking his head, why did we ever put those two together? But they have formed such a solid partnership that was built on faith and love for each other that has benefited both of them tremendously. For years, Barnabas served as Paul's mentor, but over the course of time, they were no longer mentor and apprentice. They were equals. Dare I say, friends. They cared for each other. They loved one another. And because of that, because of their shared passion, they were invited by the church as a whole to go and go on missionary journeys and establish churches around the world. They would travel all throughout the place, and everywhere they went, they would usually go about the same style. They would walk into town. Almost always they would start at the Jewish synagogue in that area. Right? That makes sense. If you're a Jewish person, you've been waiting for the Messiah your entire life. So to hear, hey, Messiah came. His name was Jesus. That seems like an easy in to be able to establish some new believers. But they would go there and they would continue to preach the gospel all throughout whatever town it was that they were in. They would join together with these people, and as others came to faith, they would stay on to help build up that faith, to help them grow, to encourage them, to disciple them, to teach them, to do all the things that early church did. Once they felt that they were finally in a place solid in their faith, they would leave and head to the next town that the Holy Spirit would guide them to. They would start it all over again in the hopes to be able to do so. After they had traveled all over the world, Paul and Barnabas found themselves back at Antioch, a place that kind of was a hub for them. And it's while they're there that Paul gets an idea. And I think it's a pretty good idea. It's there where we're going to pick up the text. But again, I want to warn you before we get into it. You might be wondering how this text could be seen as encouraging. Acts chapter 15, starting in verse 36. It says this, "And after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, 'Let us return and visit the brothers in every city where we proclaim the word of the Lord and see how they are.' Now Barnabas wanted to take with them John, called Mark. But Paul thought it best not to take with them one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to do the work. And there arose a sharp disagreement, so that they separated from each other. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus. Paul chose Silas and departed, having been commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. And he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches." So often, whenever this particular narrative is discussed within the church, we tend to focus on the idea that Paul and Barnabas sort of break up here. Right? I think I've heard this text preached in several different sermons throughout my life, and that's always the focal point, that these two separated from each other, these two early fathers of the church. And I'm certain that hearing that Paul and Barnabas were parting ways, that had to be surprising to the early church. Again, for years, these two had been around each other. They'd been tied at that hip. They had done everything together. And so to hear that they were breaking up, that they were parting ways, had to feel a little like finding out the Beatles were breaking up. I got to come up with a more relevant, right? That was like 50 years ago. But still, that's how big and how epic it was to find out that these two people who had been so amazing, so brilliant, who had established so many churches together, are now parting ways. But the thing we oftentimes miss when it comes to this text, the part that we always overlook when it comes to this whole notion, is why. Why did they part ways? Why did they have this disagreement? Why did they break up? And it's right there in verses 37 and 38. Now Barnabas wanted to take with them John, called Mark. But Paul thought best not to take with them one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. During the course of their first missionary journey, Paul and Barnabas brought with them a young man named John, who also went by the name Mark. But for one reason or another, Mark bailed. We're never really told why. We're given the impression that he was a young man when they went on this journey, and so it's likely that he was homesick. He had never been so far away from his family, and so he got scared. I mean, if you go to a college campus and you watch the freshmen over the course of the first week or two, you're always going to find one who's ready to drop out and go home. Because they're nervous. They don't know what to do. They don't know how to function with that. And so for Mark, he just went home. And when he left and went home, that meant that they were a man short, which meant that they had to do everything they could to kind of cover the work that he was supposed to do the things that Mark had been assigned. And so as they finish this journey and as they get ready to go to a second one, Barnabas wanted to extend an invitation to Mark, to give him another shot, to encourage Mark. God's not done with him. Mark was likely fully aware of how much he had affected Paul and Barnabas by bailing. We know Paul liked to write letters. I'm sure there was probably a pretty nasty one. So Mark knew that what he had done had hurt them. And so Paul didn't want to bother with them. I'm going to be real with you. In this narrative, I think I would probably align myself closer to Paul. I'm not proud of that. But I'm kind of in that mode of if you let me down once, you're going to do it again. So I'm reluctant to allow people back into my life that have done that. And Barnabas is like, no, let's give the kid another shot. They couldn't agree so much so that Barnabas believed so much in Mark that God had a purpose and a plan for Mark's life. He was willing to part with his closest friend. Because that's how much he believed. There's got to be a part there's part of me that thinks that whenever Barnabas came and extended that invitation to Mark to say, hey, I want to take you on my next missionary journey, and Paul didn't agree, so we broke up. There's got to be a part of Mark that goes, me? Why would you want to do that? I let you down last time. But Barnabas knew that Mark needed the encouragement to keep going. He needed to have the opportunity to know that just because he failed once didn't mean that God was done. And it turns out Barnabas was right. And Paul himself would later realize that. When Paul wrote his second letter to Timothy, his mentee, the one that he poured himself into, the one that he had done for him what Barnabas had done for Paul. As he wrote to Timothy in 2 Timothy 4, verse 11, he writes this. He said, Luke alone is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you. Do not miss this part. For he is very useful to me for ministry. I have to wonder if as Paul wrote that in that letter, did he sit back and smirk and go, Barnabas was right. We all need a Barnabas. We all need someone who cares for us, who believes in us, who's willing to fight for us, who's willing to spur us on and help us continue on in our faith. None of us is perfect in our faith. It's oftentimes the joke that there's only ever been one perfect person and we killed him. It's far easier for us to be critical of each other. It is far easier for us to point out the faults in each other. It is far easier for us to tear each other down. But it takes actual effort to be encouraging. It takes actual effort on our part to seek to build someone up. Again, we don't know this for a fact, but when Barnabas extended that offer to Mark had to wonder, why me? I've already let you down. How do you know I'm not going to do it again? But I also have to believe that it meant the world to Mark that Barnabas was willing to give him that second chance. That Barnabas believed so much into him that he would extend that offer yet again. And it would not only lead to him flourishing in his ministry, but even changing the mind of Paul himself to see that Mark was in fact worth the effort. Again, encouraging words are always needed. The world around us seems to be on a never-ending mission to try to tear us down, to hurt us, to call our faith dumb, to say an endless barrage of hurtful things. And if you're anything like me, oftentimes you don't need the world to do that. You do a pretty good job of tearing yourself down. I don't need people to point out my failings. I am keenly aware of them. So we need people who are willing to build us up. The church should not be a place where we receive more hurtful things said about us. That's why gossip is so horrible. I heard a preacher say once, and I think I agree with him, I'd rather hear you say every curse word in the book than to hear you gossip about somebody else. The church should be a place where we are finding encouragement. In fact, it's expected of the church to be an encouragement to those people. Paul would write in 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 11, therefore encourage one another and build one another up. This is the big part of this verse. Just as you are doing. It's expected that the church be a place of encouragement, and a church in community is a church that seeks to build each other up, that delights in the growth of others, that shares in the burdens of when life slaps them down, that's willing to pull each other up after they stumble. And when that happens, we can make a difference in this world. It can change us from the inside out. It can make all of the difference in our lives and in our faith, just as it's done for one of our own. I asked Alan Bradshaw to share his story of the encouragement that he received from this community and this body of believers. And like BL and Paul Keeney before him, he asked if I could just read it for him. Though I think, knowing Alan, probably more so it could stay on point and not veer off into different side stories. Am I right there, Alan? Yeah. So these are Alan's words, not my own. He says, when I was 8 years old, I knelt, repented, and accepted God's grace and forgiveness for my sins, along with my mom, sister, and brother on the same night. From that day, I was raised to follow Jesus, and many people poured into me, from pastors, teachers, youth leaders, and camp counselors. I did follow him closely for over 20 years. Then, following some trials, I began to fall away from everything I'd been taught, until those lessons began to vanish bit by bit. For over 22 years, life without that grace I received took me further away from him than I ever intended to go. I had completely removed God from life and was miserable beyond belief. Finally, in my lowest moment, a song came on the car radio, Cry Out to Jesus by Third Day. It reminded me where my hope was, and when I got home, I knelt again at 52 years old and repented and found that he was still there. My life was changed and my sins and misery were gone. My wife and I began to come to Lexington Church of Christ after being invited by her boss, Brian Liming. I was being poured into again by so many of the members, Brian and Sue, Ray and Judy Mitchell, the Wilsons and the Doves, as well as our pastor and our youth pastor. I was growing in the faith again, but after a few years, I began to be reminded of my past sin. And even though I had been forgiven, I was still carrying the shame of my past around with me. And it was starting to make me think I was not usable to God's or our church's service. I just felt unworthy. And then Scott Williams, our youth minister at the time, began to counsel me without me actually telling him about my struggle. He asked me to go along with the youth group and others on a mission trip during which we had a few encouraging conversations. After the trip, I talked to our pastor, TJ, and Joel Likens about what I was going through. And I received so much encouragement to lay it all down and receive confirmation that I was forgiven. Then a few months later, during a Good Friday service that emphasized laying it all down at the cross and leaving it, put together by Scott, I did just that. That was 10 years ago. I'm so grateful for Scott, TJ, and Joel for truly listening to the Holy Spirit. If it were not for their encouragement, their prayers, and walking through it with me, I may still be carrying what I was never meant to carry. I praise God for using those men. Alan, I thank you for your story. And it is painstakingly obvious to me that because of the encouragement you received from these guys, you yourself seek to encourage others. Something that my own family has benefited from, and I can't thank you enough for that. Encouragement is the lifeblood of the church. It helps to build the community within the church in a way that creates real, lasting change. But as with everything else that we've discussed throughout this series, it begins when we love each other. Everything that we do must be rooted in that love. No matter what we do, if we seek to be a church in community, it begins, ends, and always throughout the middle is through our love for one another. Encouragement can change lives, but it must be found in our love. Being a church in community is worth pursuing. It is worth working towards. It is worth fighting for. Because a church in community can't help but change the community around it. So as we close out this series, just because we end the series doesn't mean that we shouldn't stop pursuing being a church in community. One final time in this series, let's again close out with the words of Jesus in John 13, verse 34 and 35. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you are also to love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another.